First, Austria-Hungary. Despite the fact that the Habsburgs ruled both regions for a very long time, Austria-Hungary itself as a country was kind of short-lived. It was created after the Compromise of 1867, only lasting until it started losing World War I in 1918. It was a powerful country in Europe, being its third most populated at a time. Their empire was dissolved, and a bunch of new countries were created. The original territories, if you will, separated into Austria and Hungary, which we all know today. Next, Czechoslovakia. A good follow-up because Czechoslovakia was actually part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, becoming sort of independent and being created in 1918 as a republic. They inherited a lot of the Austro-Hungarians' industry, so they had a pretty good kickstart as a country, although later on suffering from their proximity to Germany in World War II, being invaded and occupied by the Germans. After the war, their troubles weren't over yet, being sort of occupied or at least heavily influenced by the Soviets until close to the end of the Cold War. Afterwards, they dissolved into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, which is how they remain today. Going a little back in time, we have neutral Morsnet. Like a lot of what happened in Europe, this is the fault of Napoleon, or a consequence of his defeat at least. In 1815, Morsnet was created, with a size of less than 2.5 square kilometers. It was squeezed between Prussia and Belgium, and both countries shared its rule, sort of what happens today with Andorra between Spain and France. It used to be Dutch and Prussian, but in 1830, Belgium got its independence, and they took the custody of Morsnet with them. The reason for this double custody was that the Dutch and the Prussians could not decide on who would keep the region. It was valuable because of an important zinc mine in it. When the zinc mine dried up, there was a dramatic loss of interest in it by neighboring powers. In World War I, Germany annexed it, but a few years later and after the war in 1920, it was fully given to Belgium. Today, it's part of the Belgian city of Kelmis. All the way in America, Vermont. Now, I know what you're thinking, Vermont is a US state, not a country, but it used to be, at least kind of. In its early days, Vermont tried to be its own country. It was part of the colony of New York, ruled by the British. But in 1777, it declared its independence, even drafting a constitution of liberal values and outlawing slavery, a pretty modern line of thought for the time. They even had their own coins. In the meantime, the 13 colonies revolted against the British and became independent as the United States of America, but they didn't let Vermont in. They said that before they could join, they needed to resolve its issue with New York, who claimed it as part of their territory. They even considered going back to their old rulers by joining Canada, but ended up not doing so. They stayed independent until 1790, finally resolving their issue with New York and joining the US as its 14th state. Moving to Asia, we have Ceylon, lasting from 1505 to 1972. This is a pretty long lifespan for a country, at least compared to some on this list. It's better known as Sri Lanka, its current modern name. It was a trading center in the Arab world since the 7th century. Later on, in colonial periods, it was taken over by Europeans and used for the same thing, changing hands a few times between the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British. The British were the last rulers, from 1815 to 1948. After that, Ceylon gained its independence, and about 30 years later, in 1972, they changed their name to Sri Lanka. A little to the northeast, Sikkim. Sikkim was located between Nepal and Bhutan, a small Himalayan monarchy, created in 1642, about the size of Rhode Island, which is the smallest state in the US. It has a long history, being independent for over 300 years. It had Buddhist kings for most of its history. Even though it's small, it houses a gathering of many people. 11 languages are spoken there, and most people are of Tibetan, Nepali, and Indian descent. In 1975, it was incorporated into India as its 22nd state, after 97% of the people voted to join in a referendum, something that was heavily objected against by China but resolved with India's recognition of Tibet as a Chinese territory. Next, we have the Ashanti Empire, created in the 1600s. Today, it's a part of Ghana. It was incredibly rich economically and had some military power compared to others in the region. Colonialism and European trade made the country even richer, but then it became part of Great Britain's trade routes for gold. You can probably guess what happened next. The British showed up, took control, and exiled the Ashanti royal family. It became part of the British Empire as a protectorate for a few years until the end of colonialism. Interestingly, it's still technically a country, or an independent region. Ghana recognizes the Kingdom of Ashanti as an independent traditional state. Their king still has some influence in the region. Next, we have the United Arab Republic. This isn't as much of a state as it is a political union. I guess on the scale of country unions, it would be somewhere between an alliance and a full union. It was a political union between Syria and Egypt, and its main objective was to attack Israel. It only lasted for 3 years, and it was in fact Syria which seceded from the new republic. But who can blame them? A union between two countries who don't even share a border is kind of doomed to fail. US interference and support of Israel might have also made them realize that their main objective was doomed to fail, and so the purpose of the union no longer existed. In South Central Africa, Rhodesia. Rhodesia is now known as Zimbabwe and Zambia. It declared its independence in 1965, but was not recognized by most as such. It was located in southern Africa, between Angola and Mozambique, and it was managed by the British, which explored it for gold, copper, and coal. Interestingly, it was a point of dispute between the British and the Portuguese in the early 20th century. The Portuguese wanted to join Angola and Mozambique by taking control of the region, and they demanded it from the British. The British refused and issued an ultimatum to the Portuguese. You either accept that you're not taking it or we go to war. The Portuguese caved and it remained a British territory. The weakness of the Portuguese monarchy in this event is said to have been one of the reasons which fueled the rise of republicanism and the Republican Revolution in Portugal. So despite not getting their independence right away, they did cause a major change in another country. Finally, in 1979, the Rhodesian Bush War took place, and the region finally gained its independence. And finally, back in Europe, the Republic of Salo, also known as the Italian Social Republic. This is an incredibly short-lived state, and also a consequence of a war. During World War II, in its later years, Italy had been invaded and liberated by Allied troops in almost its entirety. So Mussolini had to escape. And to do so, he moved to Salo in northern Italy, creating a new state which was essentially a German satellite. This happened in 1943. It counted mostly on German troops to ensure its defense and existence, and it was precisely with the defeat of the Axis forces in Italy in 1945 that the short-lived state came to an end. So those are 10 countries in the world which no longer exist.